Hello, good morning. We're waiting for the attendees to arrive, just maybe a few more seconds. All right, we have participants following us on Facebook as well. Let's roll. Hello and welcome to this online event held jointly by Bay Atlantic University in Washington, D.C. and the Global Policy Institute. For the next hour, we will be talking about Afghanistan, specifically the war in Afghanistan that lasted from 2001 until about 2 weeks ago. My name is Cenk. I'm a journalist and adjunct professor on media and politics. My guest today is an expert on global affairs as well as US politics, Professor Paolo von Schirach. He's the president of the Global Policy Institute and the chair of Political Science and International Relations Department here in Bay Atlantic University. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning to you, Cenk, and to all our guests.
As we begin our conversation, I would like to remind you, our audience, that we'll welcome your questions. So please feel free to ask them in the chat section if you're following us on Zoom. Okay, this is called What Happened in Afghanistan. As some of you may remember, we did a similar event on the the mob rioting into the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. a while ago, and we titled that as What Happened at the Capitol. So on this series of conversations with Professor von Schirach, we'd like to explore some of the things that invade the top of the agenda in our daily lives, and we assume that we have all the information about. However, most of the time, we don't. So, Professor, since we designed these events keeping students in mind as well, let me begin, if you will, by setting the stage. Three days ago, it was the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in the US. And those attacks, widely seen as the core reason of the war in Afghanistan. Could you tell us a bit about why the US and its Western partners invaded Afghanistan in the first place? Because sometimes the idea that comes as the greatest one back in the day turns out to be a bad one as time progresses by.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Let's start from the beginning. And the beginning, most unfortunately, was the 9/11 attacks against the United States. An unprecedented act of terror, which occurred on September 11, 2001. This is a generation ago now. You know, there are many people probably following us today, I would venture saying, who maybe were not born at the time, if they're students, or were very little to really comprehend and understand what was going on at the time. So the United States was the victim of a massive terror attack, the Twin Towers in New York City, an airplane hitting the Pentagon here near Washington, D.C., and another one that crash landed in Pennsylvania, but it seemed, according to all accounts, that it was headed for the U.S. Capitol here or the White House, either one, here in Washington, D.C. But because passengers figured out through cell phone communications on the ground what was going on, tried to regain control of the aircraft. Anyway, it crash landed and everybody unfortunately perished. So that being the case, it didn't take long for US intelligence at the time to understand what happened, who were the hijackers and where this whole plot originated from. And it became quite clear that the hijackers belonged to this terror organization called Al-Qaeda, the base, and that it was, an offshoot, the manifestation of the thinking and organizational skills of Osama bin Laden, a prominent Saudi citizen coming from a very wealthy family in Saudi Arabia, who, however, developed his own ideas about true Islam. And we won't get into all the story of the origins of Al-Qaeda and what happened, etc. However, it is important to know that at earlier times, when Afghanistan, and that's how we come to our topic, was occupied by the Soviets, there was a resistance movement which was called the Mujahideen, who attracted other believers, against this war. This war against the invaders, and they came from all over, including Osama bin Laden and others. So this is how the connection with Afghanistan was established. Later on, let's skip through many other stages. Osama bin Laden negotiated, I guess, some kind of a, sanctuary arrangement with the then government of Afghanistan, which was the Taliban. And so the Taliban welcomed Al-Qaeda as an honored guest, if you wish, on its soil, and allowed Al-Qaeda to set up, organizational headquarters, training camps for its recruits, and many other things. And so U.S. intelligence, after 9/11, figured out that this whole thing was orchestrated by Al-Qaeda, and decided that it was appropriate to retaliate against Al-Qaeda, which was in Afghanistan, of all places, and also against the Taliban regime, after having posed the question to them, say, either you turn over to us, Americans, bin Laden and his associates, or we consider you, the Taliban, as an accomplice, and therefore just as guilty as those who organized and masterminded the attacks against the U.S. homeland. That set the stage for the invasion, because the Taliban refused and said.
So if I can interrupt,
Sure.
Shortly after the 9/11 attacks, in about 2 weeks, the first U.S. Special Forces teams were on the ground in Afghanistan to chase and kill Al-Qaeda cells. And less than 1 month after, the first U.S. troops were authorized to go there. However, we know that Al-Qaeda is a fluid organization, and almost immediately it moved to Pakistan and to the mountains. So it left us with Taliban, which was not the direct enemy, but as you mentioned, the one that harbored the terrorist cells. So when did this war of the US that was hastily put in place because of the big trauma of 9/11 attacks, and when I say big trauma, I'm not taking it lightly, it's unprecedented. When did this war turn its focus from eliminating terrorists to nation building in Afghanistan?
Well, that's the question, Cenk. Absolutely, that's the question. And something that makes you scratch your head and you say, wait a minute, what was the mission again? The mission was go after the bad guys, and the bad guys were Al-Qaeda, and of course the top echelons, starting with Osama bin Laden. Sadly, due to a variety of mistakes, including the types of troops that were deployed in this highly big, complicated terrain. Afghanistan is highly mountainous, wild territories, etc. And Americans knew that bin Laden and others were hiding in this Tora Bora, area, which is in mountains and caves and very inaccessible terrain. Well, anyway, they sent the wrong. It failed. All right, let's be honest. It failed. Osama bin Laden escaped, probably to Pakistan at that point, and then who knows what afterwards. And we didn't catch him for 10 years. But the Taliban was chased out of power, And the United States at that point, and I'm not sure that there was a particular moment, how can I say, a pivotal moment that would say, you know what, okay, as we're here in Afghanistan, I'll tell you what, let's have a do-over. Let's remake this country. I am not sure that there was and make it into a nice modern democracy that will be organized according, let's say, to Western style principles by ourselves, the Americans. And by the way, remember, this was a NATO operation because the NATO treaty was triggered by the fact that the US was attacked. The NATO treaty provides that an attack against one is an attack against all. And so many NATO countries contributed with, in various ways, with contingents, forces, this and that. And so this became a huge, quite frankly, mess, where everybody, with so many cooks in this kitchen, which became Afghanistan, and everybody was there trying to do something. But indeed, the primary mission, which was go after Al-Qaeda and get them, succeeded only in part. And the part that succeeded was that Al-Qaeda was kicked out of Afghanistan, and the facilities that they enjoyed and the organizational structure that they had set up in Afghanistan was destroyed, which is a good thing because it disrupted their operational abilities. But Al-Qaeda itself was not destroyed. It simply took a good hit, but it managed to reorganize elsewhere. So this is when I would say, and we can say this with the benefit of hindsight, this is when the tragedy really starts, with this effort to redo Afghanistan.
The feeling of the international community right after the 9/11 attacks, as I recall, and the literature tells us, that we're not safe. The international community felt like we're not safe in our homes, and it's not enough for us to keep us safe here as long as there are some bad guys out there. So son Bush, Bush Jr., he started this war on global terrorism, as you recall. And he actually dictated the nations of the world to join him in this war on global terror, whatever that meant. And at the time, it felt like a great idea. So nobody that I can recall opposed it. And I want to ask you that, do you think this was kind of like a continuation of democracy exporting democracy to some other countries following the Iraq experience?
Well, look, here's the thing. The notion of make the world safe, go after the terrorists, and never stop and never and never sleep until you have eliminated the terror threat sounds like a good idea, except that if you go down to the nitty-gritty, you realize that this is a dream. This is like saying, we order the police force to fight crime, and we will not be happy until all the criminals in this entire nation have been apprehended, and there will be no more criminal acts of any kind whatsoever. Try as they may, the police can be quite good, but the notion that they can eliminate any crime, at some point, because all the criminals or would-be criminals have been safely apprehended, is a dream, right? This is why we keep having police forces, and it's kind of it's a constant back and forth, where police can, yes, sometimes how can I say, prevent crime, and in most instances try to go after criminals after criminal acts have been committed. The notion that the United States had the resources, the ability, the intelligence, the know-how to go after all terrorists around the world is, quite frankly, and I'm not saying this lightly, it's silly. It is childish. It's an impossibility, because it takes one person with a big, machine gun and lots of of reloads to commit a terrorist act. One person is enough. In the case of 9/11, it was much more sophisticated and more complex, but it was 19 hijackers. That's 19. The whole operation didn't cost that much money. It was fairly well organized and structured, and it took a long time. But this was not this was not World War III, okay? This was not army divisions and aircraft carriers and airplanes moving in and what have you. This was 19 hijackers with box cutters. This is all there was. Very clever, very ingenious, I have to say. But this is something that, yes, you can prevent another 9/11 of that kind, but you can't hope to prevent everything from a point onward. So the idea that in order to make America safe, we needed to be in Afghanistan and sort of immunize the entirety of Afghanistan against the threat of Islamic radicalism so that Al-Qaeda or any other organization would never have a chance to establish itself. And so at that point, we are safe, is a delusional, because these organizations move. They move around. They're very fluid. They can, even if displaced and even if wounded, they can reorganize, regroup, and go someplace else. The world. So
why do you think nobody saw this in the first place? If it was a war that is impossible to win, how come this war wants a consensus among all the political actors in the US and it turned into something that nobody wanted anymore? It was unpopular towards the end.
It's a very, very appropriate question, Cenk, and I wish I had the answer. I think there was a general sense of I don't know what to say, of wishful, prisoners of fantasies and wishful thinking. And so the notion, so there are two problems here intertwined. One is that the war on terror was something that could be done and that could be, quote, won. Remember, I remember this from my old, studies in strategy. Good old Clausewitz said that in a war, it's not the winner that says I won, it's the loser that says I lost. Okay, and until the loser says I lost, you haven't won. So as long as you can hit terrorists here and there, in Afghanistan, in Africa, elsewhere, whatever, wherever they may be, wherever they may have their organizations and cells, but until there are some residual cells with some operational ability that can continue to do harm, you have not won, okay? So the notion that you can have this war and have all the allies that you want, the NATO countries and any other willing partner, and that at some point you can declare victory is absolutely preposterous. That's number one. The second issue is that anybody who would know anything about the complexities and the difficulties and the pitfalls, regarding backward emerging countries, and in case of Afghanistan, I wouldn't even call it an emerging country. Was it just a desperately poor, backward country where there was absolutely almost nothing? When the Americans got in, the country was exhausted and destroyed after years and years of war and horrible Taliban regime. The country had no railroads, no roads, almost no electricity, not even the semblance of a viable economy. Most people were poor and illiterate. The notion that you can go there without having any history of relations with people that you send in as experts and consultants who don't speak the language, who don't know much about the culture, the traditions, the religion, the tribal makeup of the country, and that you can say, no problem, we are Americans, we are problem solvers, we can go in and fix it, and in no time we'll turn this country around. This is the pinnacle of stupidity. I'm sorry, I'm using strong language here, and arrogance, to believe that because we're so smart, we can actually do this. And I would say that you can do this assuming unlimited time and unlimited funding. If you assume that you have a few centuries to do this, maybe you can do it. But the fact that we couldn't accomplish much in 20 years, which is a generation, tells you something about how misguided those who set this whole process in motion were to begin with. And I find it baffling that there was so little ability to analyze yourself, meaning, okay, we've been doing this for a while. How are we doing? Is this, are we reaching our objectives? Are we advancing on this? You know, that's where things get really, really difficult for me to understand, because with all the resources of this government, it seemed that this very simple, you know, self-reflection of pausing and say, are we making progress here or not? And if not, why not? It seemed like this very obvious question eluded policymakers, by the way, on both sides, Republicans and Democrats.
That's what I want to say. What you've been telling us expands to the era of 4 different administrations from both sides of the political spectrum. And another thing that you mentioned, I want to bring up, talk about the process during which trillions of dollars were spent. Maybe not much achieved on the ground. However, some people got richer and richer. Am I not right?
Unfortunately, this massive injection of American funding, conspired to fuel a corruption culture that was already there. Starting from the very beginning, if you go back to the early stages, how the CIA, which initially, at the very early stages of the intervention in Afghanistan, the CIA was in the lead. Then the operation was taken over by the Defense Department. Since it's a war, you would think, yes, maybe that's more appropriate. But how did the CIA manage to convince many of the local potentates, the warlords in different regions, to turn sides? With bags of cash. Very simple, very persuasive argument. You know, you go to a warlord and you say, hey, there's a nice suit. You see this? It's a bag full of dollars. How much? Well, it's a couple of million here, but there's more to come. Which side are you on? You know, very simple calculation. And this is how the war, how the tide turned. And later on, you know, a lot of money came into the country. Much of it was, at least at the early stages, was in cash, and therefore it sort of disappeared. To this day, sadly, the US government doesn't know what happened with some, at least, of the funding that was allocated to Afghanistan. But
not only on the, sorry to interrupt, but not only on the Afghani side, but on the US side, a lot of defense contractors made a fortune out of this, right?
I'm sure lots of, you know, look, I think the country as a whole lost, because, you know, we have devoted $2 trillion over this long span of time, in excess of $2 trillion to the effort to rebuild the country. Some of which, of course, was military, but the vast majority was civilian. But let's say, who made money? Well, of course, you have a defense contractor, and you have, as we did later on, resupply and re-equip the Afghan army. And you have to send them, you know, trucks and you know, Humvees and this and that and howitzers and light weapons. I'm sure somebody makes this stuff, right? And somebody makes money selling it. There's a slew of a sort of another industry of security services.
Which they don't want the war to end anytime soon if it keeps going, right?
Of course, from their perspective, this is wonderful. Keep it going as long as you can. If you are running a major private security company, which is not government, but it's a private security effort, many you know, entities that operated in Afghanistan, including companies implementing development projects and what have you, relied heavily on these security services. And of course, you pay them and you tuck them into the price of the contract. You say, okay, this much to do the contract plus this much for security, and this is the total price. If I am running a security company, I say, boy, this is wonderful. keep this going. If it goes on another 20 years, I am so happy because that's profit for my outfit. That said, so I would not be inclined to think that the engagement in Afghanistan was driven primarily by the defense contractor or others who profited and benefited from this endless effort. Because ultimately it's the US taxpayer that was on the hook, and ultimately most of the money was not plowed back into the United States in terms of profits for some outfits, even though quite clearly some did. But I would be suspicious to say, oh, this is how this explains it. This is how this war kept going and going and going, because so many companies and outfits and corporations gained from it.
But they might have contributed to the perception that we are winning, whatever that means, in Afghanistan, and the victory is imminent, and there's no way that we can get out of there. So we should keep go on what we're doing.
Yeah, certainly. If I am, again, I repeat a little bit what I said. If I'm a contractor, including contractors that provide healthcare services, education services, construction services, renewal or training programs for Afghan civil servants, I am not going to be raising the red flag that says, guys, we've been doing this now for 10 years. I tell you what, it's not working. And therefore, we think we should just let this thing go.
Nobody's going to say
I am making money out of this, right? I have every interest either to keep quiet, say nothing, or to say, well, maybe it's not perfect, but we're making progress. So why don't we just continue more of the same? Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let's go on with our thinking. 9/11, it was a unifying moment for people in the US, and it was a driving force for the US to claim its world superpower status after the Cold War era ended. The pretext was that, as we mentioned, nobody was safe anymore, and that we must do whatever is necessary to make sure we're safe, not only in our borders but everywhere. All this money, trillions of dollars, and all these lives, efforts, what was it for? Was it to see a humiliating ending and leaving a broken country in the hands of the original enemy, Taliban? What lessons do you think the US foreign policy establishment should take from this experience?
Oh, that's a very, very good question. And I pray that there will be enough wisdom here in Washington and across the nation, etc., to say, okay, what have we done here? This enormous undertaking, which started in Afghanistan and then continued in Iraq under similar assumptions, not the same, because it was not proven, certainly, that Iraq had anything to do directly with 9/11, although some really wanted to make that case very badly, without success. But the second issue was, okay, maybe they're nothing to do with 9/11, but they're developing they have weapons of mass destruction, which could end up in the hands of terrorists. So it's more or less the same thing. So after Afghanistan, let's go into Iraq. Great idea. So one mistake compounded by a second and arguably even bigger one in Iraq, which followed a year later. But now if we look at this together and we say, why is it that we got it so wrong? I am not sure if the lessons have been learned. Even today, in the commentary, highly partisan commentary against President Joe Biden, and admittedly, the clumsy, improvised, not very well thought through modality of withdrawal from Afghanistan, many commentators say, well, wait a minute, just wait a few minutes. And now that the Taliban are back in Afghanistan, they will be Al-Qaeda and this and that and the other and all their friends and cousins, and stand ready for another 9/11, okay? Thinking Afghanistan is the go-to place for the terrorists of the world, because like they cannot go anyplace else, right? Now that the Taliban are back in charge, they'll call all their friends and colleagues from the jihad, the global jihad, and Afghanistan once again will be the source of our problems. And chances are they will be attacked again from Afghanistan. And this is all due to the stupidity of President Biden, who, with just a little bit of effort, could have continued our presence there and prevent this from happening. Now, this analysis, while there are some elements of, some of it may be true, is so overly simplistic that it is, again, silly. The problem with terrorism is that it is not a country that you go after, that you can declare war to. Terrorism is a modality to engage in violent acts to obtain political gains that is quite diffuse and fragmented, and that operationally, it's, as I indicated earlier, it's quite simple. It's not that complicated. And that in order to fight terrorism, you need mostly intelligence services and dedicated special forces, just like against crime. But if you said that in 2004, like then Democratic candidate John Kerry did, he was lambasted as somebody who just didn't get it, because he said, look, it's a chronic problem, just like fighting drugs. We're going to fight terrorism endlessly, and we should, because it's a problem, but it is not a problem that you solve. It's a problem that you try to manage. And by describing terrorism in less apocalyptic terms of good versus bad, righteous versus evil, etc., he was ridiculed as somebody who didn't get it, who didn't understand that this was kind of a historic moment of confrontation between America, the forces of good, and terrorism, the forces of evil, and that this required, and all of government, all hands on deck, and until the final, absolute victory that would come if we continue the war on terror. By describing it as a chronic illness that needs attention and focus, but it's not something you deal with and defeat once and for all, John Kerry lost the elections in 2004, among other reasons. So what am I saying with all this? Have we learned that lesson? Have we realized that terrorism is a problem? It certainly is, and something that our security services have to be on the lookout for and check out for plots and any ideas or any plans to do this and that, and do it as best as we can, but that we cannot have guaranteed security, because it's an impossibility to achieve that ultimate result. But nonetheless, we're going to do our best and devote whatever resources we think are necessary. But this is essentially a police operation. It's intelligence and police, not a war. Have we learned that lesson once and for all? And have we learned the lesson that you are not going to immunize the world by going from country to country and making them into viable, modern, vibrant democracies in order to solve the terror problem? Have we really learned this lesson? I would hope we have, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, can we maybe say that the war in Afghanistan was not only a political and military campaign, but also a public relations campaign? Because if something like 9/11 happens at your watch, then you are forced to do something and do it right now, right that time. So, and then it's not easy for you to know when to stop, because as you said, there is no time that dictates that you have won. So it goes on and on and on. And in the process, administrations change and governments change, and money piles up. And right now is where we are. What can you say about the credibility and reputation of the US from this point onwards?
Look,
how about its international engagements from now on?
excellent question. Of course, if you read the Chinese official, Communist Party press, what do they say? Look at that, the Americans, they've been defeated, proving once again that they are a country in decline, now withdrawing from their overstretched, overseas commitments. What does it tell you? They're on the way out, and guess what? Who's on the way up? We are, China. So this is a narrative that has been, relentlessly pursued by the Chinese Communist Party, by the Russians, by the Arab media that, that is not necessarily all of it jihadist, but certainly with a significant anti-American slant, and other places too. And so whichever way you look at it, America defeated in Afghanistan, America that had failed to properly coordinate and organize this withdrawal with its NATO allies, therefore sowing mistrust between America and Europe. And then if you are, I don't know, in Taiwan today, and you look at the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, lesson learned. Is America going to come to the rescue of Taiwan if attacked by China? Well, I wouldn't be so sure. Look what they've just done in Afghanistan, and on and on and on. I think this is a bit overdone. I do not think for a moment that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and let's put things in perspective, what Biden did, President Biden, and certainly he's rightly criticized for the modality and the confusion of the withdrawal. It wasn't really that much. The American residual force in Afghanistan, when Biden said, okay, let's pull the plug, we're done here, we're going home, was 2,500 men, none of them combat troops, okay? If by withdrawing a residual, nominal, symbolic force, the whole of Afghanistan collapses, well, that tells you, again, how solid the construction was. And so what America did at the very end was just to pull the plug after having whittled down and diminished the commitment. President Trump, whatever you may say about his leadership, what he did was pretty clear. Let's get out. Okay, President Trump said, let's get out of Afghanistan. Endless war, we don't want it, bad idea. And he diminished the American troops, which were already fairly low numbers, from about 15,000 to the 2,500 that Biden found. And of course, Trump initiated the diplomatic engagement and leading to some kind of a settlement, which never occurred really, with the Taliban. That's Trump. This is what Biden inherited, but that's
how about those humiliating scenes from the Kabul airport in mid-August?
Sure, that was due to what I said earlier. That is the complete surprise in Washington, but not just in Washington. I have a couple of, maybe I can cite one personal anecdote of somebody I know quite well in the Afghan government. Nobody did have the foresight to understand how quickly the whole thing would collapse in Afghanistan. As late as July, so that's only a few months ago, top officials, I think that included the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, said, oh, yeah, things are kind of dicey in Afghanistan, but we believe that the government and the armed forces of Afghanistan, trained by the United States government, will resist. We think we give them at least a year, maybe not a year, maybe 8 months, maybe something. Well, a few days late, days, not weeks, not months, days later, it was all up in smoke. So clearly, that's no excuse. I mean, America supposedly has great intelligence. Well, its intelligence was not good enough to figure out how bad the situation in Afghanistan was and how soon the Afghan government that we supported in Kabul would collapse.
It's not a bit of an intelligence. It's the main thing. I mean, if you don't know that, it means that you don't know anything about.
That's right. That means how poorly we understood the situation of a country that we supported for 20 years, that we didn't know the level of fragility. And there was wishful thinking in saying, yes, we're leaving. The announcement, if we go just on the technical aspects of this, President Biden announced the complete withdrawal of Americans from Afghanistan in April of this year. And he said, we're going to do this by September 11th. Awkward date, if you ask me. But anyway, and then he moved that back to August 31st. So this is from April. The idea was that from April to August, we would have, the United States, ample time to organize an orderly evacuation of everybody who needed to be evacuated, starting with the personnel of the American embassy in Kabul, with all the contractors and American citizens and this and that and the other, plus all the Afghans who, or at least most of the Afghans who had supported the American forces over all these years and who could be targets for reprisal and retaliation on the part of the Taliban. Of course, these plans, such as they were, went up in smoke when the Taliban entered, Kabul without firing a shot, and the president had fled. Just a quick point, I mean, an anecdotal, but of not insignificant, just to tell you that everybody got blindsided. Somebody I know personally was actually in the government in Kabul. And I managed to speak to this person when he was still, in a safe place at Kabul airport, waiting to be evacuated eventually to Qatar, to Doha. Mm-hmm. And he told me in all this confusion and, that he was lucky to be alive. He said, I fled to the airport with the suit I was wearing. I didn't even have a carry-on bag. To tell you that there were no contingency plans. The idea was that we would soldier on, we the government in Kabul. This is an Afghan official with cabinet ranking. And he said, we never saw this coming. The President Ghani told us, we're good, we're staying, we're fighting, we're going to regroup all our forces, we'll defend Kabul, we'll do this, we'll regain the cities, whatever. And the next day he was gone.
This alone shows us maybe how big of a disconnect between the ruling elite of the so-called Afghani government and the US forces, the US decision-making body, and what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan. There has been a lot of articles appearing on reputable international media talking about how the huge US spending in Afghanistan led to the illusion of a system of institutions, while actually there was a huge system of corruption and no real results. Maybe it's time Americans learn that it's not possible to solve every problem by just throwing a bunch of dollars at them.
Well, look, another point that's worth mentioning, and again, this is something I read recently from an eyewitness, who happened to be a middle-rank British military officer who served in Afghanistan alongside US Marines. And he recounts this interesting, vignette, if you wish, that he witnessed himself. And that to me went a great length to explain why was it that until almost at the end, America supplied almost 18,000 contractors to maintain the equipment in the Afghan Air Force. Because I was scratching my head and I said, can't you teach these guys how to do this? It may be complicated, and I understand modern weapons are all high technology and electronics and computerized systems and what have you. But you would think that after some years, you would be able to train a local force of people, mechanics and whatever, who know how to maintain this equipment. Well, here's the reason why it was not done. Because as this gentleman explains, this was in a letter to The Economist that I read just last week, he says, I saw with my my own eyes at the time in which the Americans were trying to rely on Afghans to do their maintenance, pieces of equipment lying there, not operational, because the Afghans were stealing and selling the parts. Okay? And this was common knowledge. And this was, quote, the Afghan way. And everybody said, oh, well, this is how things are here. You know, thinking, fantastic. These are our allies. These are members of the armed forces that we are training, Americans, and they are making a huge business out of the spare parts for the equipment that we have supplied. And so the equipment is not fixed, repaired, and maintained because everything is stolen. That itself should have been an eye-opener, right? And
yeah, it also shows a big mismanagement on the American side. Now, I have to move to the questions
Sure.
that we've been receiving from the audience, but I have one very last question for you, and I appreciate a short answer. Do you think we're safer now?
I hope so, but there is no guarantee. We do not know.
After 20 years, the longest war in US history.
I believe our intelligence capabilities have improved for sure, but do we have a guarantee that we have disrupted everything? And there is not some group, wherever they may be, in Nigeria, in Somalia, in Sudan, wherever that may be, in Libya, that at this time, and I really hope not, I don't want to bring bad luck to this country or any other country, but that is at this time not trying to figure out something nefarious that they would like to do. I wouldn't rule that out for 1 second. Vigilance is absolutely necessary, but is it sufficient to prevent not just another 9/11, but any other type of attack that could, inflict huge losses to the United States and or our allies in Europe or other places of the world? I mean, it would be really, really presumptuous to say, you know what, we're good, we're done with this. We're not. This will continue to be out there, and how can I say, the appeal of holy war, whether it's by Islamic fanatics or others could be also plotting things against us. It's an intangible appeal that you cannot quantify. You cannot determine, oh, if you do this, then that will not happen. The only thing, as I said, is to redouble our efforts with our intelligence and with our counterstrike capabilities. But that's not guarantee of success, because there is no timeline for this to say, oh, if we just make it to the end of the year with no attacks, we're fine. Well, what about next year and the year
after? It's an ongoing process. Yes. We need to keep on doing the right thing instead of throwing a bunch of dollars all around the place. Thank you so much, Professor. I want to move to questions. We have a question from a follower, a participant. Talman Altan Shagai asks, is the Taliban government a viable threat to global security in terms of power?
The Taliban government is, that's probably the only good thing, the only silver lining in this story is the Taliban government inherited a country that is essentially completely broke. There is not 1 cent, really, literally, in the country. The money is not there. Money wasn't there to begin with because the previous government relied very, very heavily on foreign aid. About 2/3 of the Afghan government budget was foreign assistance. That has been cut. That money is not there anymore. The capital reserves of the Afghan Central Bank happen to be right here in Washington, D.C. with the Federal Reserve. Money that was supposed to come to Afghanistan via the International Monetary Fund is not reaching the country. So the country is now literally going up on fumes. The only source of reliable source of revenue for the Taliban is the drug trade, okay, which is thriving. Whether they for religious purposes, whether they think it's a good idea or not a good idea, but they certainly welcome the income that the opium trade generates. But if you discount that, which is significant but not enough, and other sources of revenue that can come from small trade, dried fruits, and other things that Afghanistan can export to Pakistan or whatever, there is no money. Afghanistan has to pay cash to buy electricity from Uzbekistan, has to pay cash to buy gasoline and diesel fuel from Iran. At some point, this cash runs out. So that's the context. Can the Taliban become a serious threat to the world in a country that is caving in, literally, financially, facing famine and huge disruption going forward? Winter is a very cold winter in Afghanistan is right around the corner. I'm not so sure that they can, run the place as if this were Switzerland. It's not.
Yeah. We have a question and a statement from Sandra Allen. She says, it is said that Afghanistan funds were greater compared to its GDP. Is that right? Yes, it is right. It's much, much bigger, like 10 times, 20 times more than the GDP of Afghanistan itself. And she says that democracies stopped being democracies, abandoning rule of law and process that worked in their own nations. I think she refers to the fact that during this war on terror, the US employed a lot of shady practices in order to tackle with the terrorists or whoever they captured in Afghanistan. What can you say about that?
Well, yes. I mean, that's not a glorious page of American history. We know, sadly, everybody who's followed these matters closely knows of the practice of waterboarding.
Guantanamo Bay.
Yes, that was inflicted upon many of the prisoners, at least the few prisoners that were taken, and then people would say, no, but wait a minute, waterboarding is really not torture. Well, it basically is to give people the sense that they're going to be asphyxiated, basically that they're going to drowned essentially. Yes, because of water being poured, and so of course they're not going to be killed, but they don't know that, and so and lawyers can debate endlessly. Oh, no, wait a minute, that was a kind of harsh interrogation, but not torture. Well, you make up your own mind as to what that is. It's certainly not a glorious page in American, we are a country of due process. And due process is, yes, you can arrest somebody and interrogate them, but you cannot torture them. So, and I think that I'm not an expert, I'm not a lawyer, but I would not say, oh, no problem, waterboarding is fine. And that's what we do normally whenever we arrest somebody and make an interrogation in any US prison or, police precinct. Yeah, sure, we do waterboarding all the time, no problem. We don't, okay?
Waterboarding is maybe only one part of the problem, right? There was the flying interrogation, like units on the airplanes and all kinds of stuff.
And of course, also, and this was lavishly used even during the Obama administration, that one of the preferred tools to hit or to try to hit suspected Al-Qaeda or Taliban, operatives at the border areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan was drone attacks. And some of these drone attacks were successful. Others, unfortunately, caused quite a bit of collateral damage. That is, maybe you hit your suspect, but you also hit other people who are bystanders, including, women and children who've got nothing to do with any of this, or sometimes you hit the wrong target to begin with because of faulty intelligence.
Yeah, even the term collateral damage is blood chilling.
Absolutely. And is that something can we say, oh, well, that's the cost of doing business? This is how things happen. I'm not sure that long-term this is viable. If you can create countermeasures, be they missiles or weapons carried by drones or anything else that can absolutely guarantee that, first of all, that you got the right target, that's intelligence, and then that you have the weapons that can, with surgical accuracy, pinpoint your target and hit that target exclusively, that's great. But I'm afraid I don't think we're there yet in terms of our precision ability and indeed intelligence. Even, fast forwarding to events in the last several days, after the terror attack at the Kabul airport, the US supposedly launched a counterstrike against an ISIS operative, allegedly ISIS operative in Afghanistan. It looks like this was a man who was, unfortunately, who was loading into his car, not explosives, but water, okay? And that looks like a horrible mistake. I don't think this was done deliberately. I don't think Americans wanted to kill an innocent person, but it looks like a tragic mistake. That
a lot of tragedies like that, yes.
Arranged in haste because we needed to show the world that we were reacting to the terror attack at the airport. And so this was done in haste, and it looks like we got the wrong guy, and we killed a family.
Yes.
At least 10 people.
Thank you. We have a question from our Facebook live stream from Shahi Sultanova. The question is, will the United States recognize Taliban government, and what's going to happen to human rights, women and kids' rights in the Taliban government? How the US will monitor the situation, do you think?
Excellent question. I think we are way off yet from a formal recognition. I don't rule this out, by the way. I'm not saying out of the question, the United States will never recognize the Taliban. It much depends on how the Taliban behaves. And this has been said many times. If the Taliban would prove that they can somehow moderate their policies and rule justly and allow a modicum of individual rights, including, of course, rights of women and girls, who, by the way, was probably one of the few good things that happened in the last 20 years. Millions of Afghan girls and then later on women had, for the first time in many cases, access to education, to jobs and other things. All this like it's over, under the Taliban rule. So taking all this together, how is the Taliban going to rule going forward? We really don't know. My suspicion is that the Taliban, to keep all its various factions together, needs to rule harshly, because this is the only thing that unites them: religious orthodoxy. If you start becoming more pragmatic because you say, hey, we need help from the West, we need money to come in from the United Nations and from Europe and from Japan and maybe later on even from the US, so why don't we just soften our image and show that we're nice people? And then other hardliners in Afghanistan say, wait a minute, this is treason. You are selling out. We are here to establish a pure emirate. That means pure jihad and Sharia law, no exceptions. So all this, I think it's up for examination going forward. Can there be a softer, nicer Taliban, a few years from now that we can deal with? I am not ruling it out. I find it hard to believe. But at the same time, I repeat what I said earlier. The Taliban now faces an enormous economic crisis going forward. Of course, some of them may count on, help coming from China, from Pakistan, from Russia. And they may say, we lost America and Europe, but hey, we got China. Well, let's see. How much money are the Chinese really willing to put into this place, which has proven to be, a black hole? We put in $2 trillion and we have nothing to show for it. Can the Chinese believe that they're going to do a lot better than we did, and make a difference in Afghanistan? I don't know. And can the Taliban government assume that now they are safe from extinction, so to speak, because China is coming to the economic and financial rescue? Good luck. I wouldn't be so hopeful if I were them. So the situation, to answer the question, is really a non-answer. I really don't know. I wouldn't rule it out that the Taliban can become something else than what it is today, but I wouldn't put I wouldn't bet on it. I wouldn't say, oh, sure, this is going to happen. I don't think so. Not anytime soon.
With that said, thank you so much, Professor. I'd like to conclude by thanking our audience following us on Zoom and on our social media accounts, Facebook live stream. Thank you so much for being us today, and I hope to see all of you again in an event in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.